My name is Barbara Altmann. I'm the provost at Bucknell, and it's an honor and a pleasure to give you a short introduction, and I promise the short part, to our speaker this evening, Makoto Fujimura. Now, I have to tell you a little anecdote first. I was introduced to Mako's work the first time I walked into President John Brovman's office. It happened to be my interview, my on-campus interview. And up in the office on the second floor of Mart's Hall, I entered through the outer office, then went into John's office. And of course, it is customary when visiting a college president to pay close attention to the president. But I had a challenge in that I kept having to throw surreptitious glances at this gorgeous, quietly luminous artwork that was on the wall just off my left shoulder. And so while I was in fact very attentive to my future employer, and I hope he didn't notice that I was somewhat distracted, I came to know Mako's work from that first impression of something that was incredibly compelling because it had a quiet dazzle to it. There was a luminescent surface on that painting that glowed with waves of a semi-transparent gold, but it overlaid great depth in a number of other colors, reds and blues and greens. So I thought, I'll have to ask about that, but I'd better wait until I've been hired. So I left, but I lingered in the outer office just briefly to look at three compelling prints that are hanging there, not knowing that those were also Mako's work. They are contemplative, they are meditative work, but they're still infused with a kind of energy that I find completely inspiring for a workplace to do what universities do, the kind of work, the heady work, grounded in value and aesthetics that we do at a good university. So it was only after that that I learned that Mako's in fact a graduate of Bucknell, and that now he is a trustee, and that I've learned that he brings to his position as trustee an expertise, a sensibility, and a range of artistic accomplishments that function much like the gold in his paintings. They add a quiet brilliance to the layers of authority and excellence that the board brings to its work at Bucknell. Any brief introduction of Mako is a challenge. His website describes him as artist, writer, catalyst, which is pretty good, but it's only a beginning. So I want to make sure to leave time for you to hear from him, in fact, and so I will reduce his many, many accomplishments and initiatives to a list of bullet points, unfortunately. But I'm glad to say that Mako helped me trim this down into what he felt was most important for the audience tonight. So he's an alumnus from Bucknell, 1983. He's also the parent of a 2013 grad, a young man who is very impressive indeed. Mako held a Japanese National Scholarship from 1986 to 92 to study traditional Japanese painting known as Nihonga, which is literally Japan painting, and that was to learn the craft he wanted to apply to his contemporary art. He won a Distinguished Alumni Award from Bucknell in 2011. As an artist, he has exhibited and shown more than 100 exhibits in galleries and museums around the world. He has an upcoming solo exhibit called Silence Homage at the Waterfall Mansion and Gallery on East 80th Street in New York, which will open on the 13th of May. You have the details there in front of you. He is the writer of several books, including Culture Care and Silence and Beauty, and I recommend both of those. They're not easygoing, but they are well worth the read. Silence and Beauty won the Aldersgate Award in 2016, so very recently. Mako is the director of the Brame Center in Pasadena and splits his time between Princeton and the Pasadena studios. It's worth noting that his repute extends to recognition by our federal government. He has held a presidentially appointed, Senate-approved position on the National Council of the Arts from 2003 to 2009, and received a Chairman's Medal upon completion of that service for outstanding contribution to the American arts. He's the recipient of not one, not two, not three, but 4 honorary doctorates, the most recent from Roanoke College in 2015. And we must point out, because he is here to speak with us, that he's chosen to give many, many commencement and keynote addresses. And it is worth telling you that the Belhaven address in 2011 was chosen by National Public Radio as one of the best commencement speeches ever. So, having heard Mako speak last year on campus in a joint presentation with his accomplished son, I know we're in for both profound thoughts and real pleasure. Let me alert you now that you'll have another chance to hear Mako in 48 hours. This Saturday at 7 p.m., the President's Office is hosting a free screening of the Martin Scorsese film Silence at the Campus Theater down on Market Street downtown with a special introduction by Mako. And he'll be offering a book signing at the end of the film of his book, Silence and Beauty. So please join us again 2 days from now at the Campus Theater on Market Street. Before I hand off to Mako, I want to make absolutely sure to acknowledge Ed and Marty Samek. Marty is there. Where is Ed? And Ed is in the middle, right in the first row. Please give them a hand. They have done so much for Bucknell. As you saw, the gallery upstairs is named for them, and they also gave the gift that funded this lectureship in particular. You will hear from Marty ever so briefly at the end after Mako has finished. Now, please join me in welcoming Mako Fujimura.
Well, thank you, Barbara, and thank you all, and thank you, Marty, and thank you for allowing this opportunity to be back on campus 30-some years later, and I'm delighted that I can be an alumni of this great university, a very unique university, and I titled my talk, The Art of Education. Just to prove that an artist can talk into a broader perspective of things. And I'll have my paintings in the backdrop. They're usually very large paintings. This one's by 7 feet by 11 feet. I won't talk about them specifically, but they'll be in the backdrop. I remember that walk to the art barn, which is across Route 15. Not many people know that it exists. But I would walk on this path alone between the cemetery and the field house, where the Graham building is now. And on some winter days after a quiet evening snow, I walked by scattering glittering powder into the morning sun. Now, I could have chosen to walk an easier path, the paved walkways next to then the soccer field that has already been plowed by diligent Bucknell staff, groundskeepers. But instead, I walked on that path up the hill, literally between life and death. All alone, trudging, and intentionally going the slower, less efficient path. What is education? What do we learn in classrooms in such a walk up a hill, in life, or even in death? I used to think that one's life could be summed up in a single narrative, that somehow we could capture a life by retelling a linear series of events as in an obituary. But now, some 30 years later, after my time here in Lewisburg, I think that we may do injustice to our lives if we only think in linear, analytical fashion. We also need to remember that the tracks we may have paved ends up as meandering, pioneering, inventing, struggling path, uniquely given to us. Perhaps the complexity of a liberal arts education can truly liberate us and bring us into a deeper knowledge of that meandering journey uniquely given to us. What is education? When we come to a place like Bucknell, we may assume that this is a place to learn. So we rarely ask that epistemological question. As an artist, my role is to ask questions that no one can answer. So I ask not only what is education, but more deeply to ask what is knowledge? Philosophers can ask this question rationally and analytically, but I'm going to approach it intuitively and imaginatively. I have been asking this question through my art and my writings ever since Bucknell. I've learned a few things along the way. Yet I continue to walk in that liminal path, space between life and death, in my art and in my writings. I trudge this trail between life's vibrant evidence of joy and the disappearing memories of death. Now, you know the play Our Town by Thornton Wilder. It's a simple play, but also haunting. Remember Emily, one of the central characters. In Act 1, she is a teenager. In Act 2, she marries. In Act 3, well, she is in that liminal path. Rows of chairs on the stage are occupied by actors playing the spirits of the dead. Emily is one of them. She had just died. Just for a moment, we're all together, Emily says. Mama, just for a moment, we're happy. Let's look at one another. I can't, she continues. I can't go on. It goes so fast. We don't have time to look at one another. I didn't realize all that was going on in life, and we never looked. Take me back up the hill to my grave. Now, Emily's soliloquy here in our town takes us back. Theater and the arts take us up the hill between life and death, between hopes and disappointments, and between where we are and where we will be. The Latin root word for the word educate is educere. It means to care, to draw out what is already in the student's soul and bring that to a higher level. It is to pause and to look at one another, what I call culture care, to see culture as an ecosystem of beholding rather than a war zone of demonizing each other, has a lot to do with care. Recently, my father passed away. He was a renowned speech and hearing acoustics researcher, scientist. I was born in Boston as he completed his postdoc research at MIT, working with a guy named Noam Chomsky. My father brought Chomsky's generative grammar theory back to Tokyo University. And in what is a typical scenario for Asian home, I did not know my father that well growing up as a small child. but it was when I began to attend Bucknell. He would drive me 3 hours to Lewisburg and drive 3 hours back. I got to know my father in those 3-hour drives. I asked him questions about his research, about our family lineage. He would ask me about my interests. I remember telling him, after about a year of thinking about my future here at Bucknell, that I wanted to actually try to make it as an artist. And my father said, "Oh, that's great. That's what I wanted to become. That's what I wanted to become." What we may become and what we seek to learn may be heavily predicated upon by the generations before us. Perhaps I would not have been an artist if it were not for a scientist who wanted to become an artist. Knowledge is linked to love as surely as death is linked to life. Is that true? I'm wondering if it is. I'm wondering if it's indeed knowledge is part of our expression of love. The Hebraic Testament book, Song of Songs, says that love is as strong as death. It was my intuitive walking on the path between the graveyard and the field house, in part my exploration and discovery of a certain way of love. You see, in order to know anything, you have to love. You have to love the subject. Now, I'm speaking of a way of knowledge that is deeper than, let's say, information knowledge. I'm speaking of a type of knowledge that moves beyond the borders of classrooms, beyond the borders of categories or disciplines, of the correct answers you gave on your exams, or your grades, or your accomplishments. I'm speaking of art and sciences and the rigors of our journey toward excellence. And I am speaking of that path that no one dares to walk upon. I am speaking of knowledge that moves us so deeply that we take the long and arduous path to get there. I am speaking of the fading memories that we whisper about on our deathbeds. I am speaking of love that is comprehensive. The Greeks identified several types of love, including philia, the love of friendship, eros, sexual love, storge, affectionate love, and agape, sacrificial love. And when I'm speaking of love, I'm speaking of all of these categories. What will we remember as our lives draw to close? I thought about that as I watched my father fall asleep, tired from our 30 minutes of deep conversation, the last conversation we had on this side of eternity. What will we remember? Or at times like that, we do not speak of what we've earned or boast of our accomplishments. These liminal moments are sacred and they are impossible to categorize or even describe fully. They certainly cannot be packaged and marketed. As I sat beside my father, I thought of these 3-hour drives on Route 80 from New Providence to Lewisburg. I thought of that journey I made alone over and over up the hill to the art barn, stepping on the snowy bank in between life and death. Art and poetry get at these indescribable moments, what the Celts called thin places, margins of experience where angels may dwell. It occurred to me that as I sat with my father, I am drawn to the liminal. I'm drawn to where the dead still speak in our awakened imaginations. That walk may have determined my destiny, but I was not alone. I came to love that walk because I felt close to those whom I love. Where then do art and knowledge and love connect? I want to share with you a passage from my new book, which is called Theology of Making. I'm working on this for probably next 3 years, but it is still my new book. In it, I give several examples of how we have misplaced the kind of deep knowledge that the arts can reach. My philosopher friend Esther Meek says we all need epistemological therapy to move away from false dichotomies set up in a modern and postmodern way of thinking. So I'm going to give you 2 examples. So in my farm in Princeton, I have chickens. I held 3 fresh eggs still warm in my hands one morning. And I thought to myself, how do you make an omelet? So I did some research and came up with YouTube videos of Jack Pepin making omelets. Have you ever seen YouTube videos of Jack Pepin making omelets? Now, no matter how many times I watched the video or read the recipe, I discovered that that is not enough to make the omelet that he's making. A recipe of an omelet is as simple as it can get. But the information on how to make a good one does not readily translate in the actual making of the thing. In other words, there's a huge gap between the informational knowledge and actual knowing of making. The same can be applied to education. There's a huge gap between knowing pedagogical concepts and the actual practice of knowing. Again, my friend Esther Meek says this: if knowing is care at its core, caring leads to knowing. To know is to love. To love will be to know. Caring and loving, she's saying, are fundamental parts of the act of making, of living. To make is also to know through our acts of love. To love, the act of creativity that taps into the greater reality behind the materials and the body. So Jack Pepin's omelette is impossible to make because it is the taste of a lifetime of knowing and loving the egg. Second example. My eldest son, Ty, grew up in an environment of creativity and the arts in New York City. Having a father for an artist is a kind of a curse. Kids quickly reach, especially boys, reach a saturation level in attending openings and cultural events. By the time my 2 boys were 13, they would roll their eyes when I asked them if they wanted to go to a gallery or museum. But when my eldest began to date a girl that he met on a mission trip to Juarez, Mexico, I asked him where he might consider taking her. He replied, "Oh, the cloisters, of course." The cloisters is one of my favorite places in the world, located in the northern end of New York City. The extension of the Metropolitan Museum, dedicated to medieval art, has been my inspiration, from the quince trees in the medieval courtyard overlooking the Hudson River, or the famed unicorn tapestries. So I asked him what he was going to show her. "Oh, the unicorn tapestries, of course." Apparently my son was listening. In between throwing baseballs and playing in their beautiful garden, He was listening to me talk about the significance of the unicorn tapestries. I'm happy to say that my son is married to this young girl, and they have 2 children. I'm recruiting them for Bucknell. So I am grateful for the unicorn tapestries. You see, love demands creativity. When you go on a date, you don't talk about doing plumbing or counting, unless you're plumbers or accountants. You talk about art. You talk about beauty. You talk about things that are maybe considered unnecessary in the world, because love demands imagination and creativity. You need beauty. You need art to love. The art of education, or educere, must be to draw upon this reality of love or to answer the demands of love. It draws upon what Dante surmised, quote, the love that moves the sun and the other stars, end quote. Even an omelet can indicate the abundance of the love embedded in creation. Creating a good omelet demands more than a recipe or informational knowledge. Creating anything good requires artistry, craft. Art is moved by that love. Does that make sense? Are you convinced? But here's the problem. Love is difficult. Love seems inaccessible at times. Or perhaps we thought we had beheld love's glory and she slipped away in a tragic manner. Love may even be considered an impossibility. So is true integrated knowledge impossible too? Is the ideal of Bucknell education an impossibility? Imagine with me being stranded on a remote island. Before long, you begin to get hungry for food. That hunger is a proof that we need something called food. And in our island of alienation, our hunger for true love may yet be a proof that such place for love exists. A person who is trapped in injustice hungers for justice, and that may yet prove that there is time for righteousness to flow in our lives until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. To quote the Old Testament book of Amos, made popular by Dr. King. This art, language of art, of imagination, invokes that mighty stream of hope. It invigorates malnourished souls, delighting those even faced with an impossible task. The goal of liberal arts education, or any type of education, is to grow our imagination to know love. To love is to hope for a rejuvenated earth and to hope for the discovery of a place that we long to be. The arts need, therefore, to be integrated into all disciplines: engineering and management, farming and philosophy. Now, today, in our time, online education presents many fantastic opportunities for students, and virtual education can give you the best of convergent thinking and proficiency. But we need places in the world where divergent thinking and empathy training can happen, where the diversity of cultures and ethnicities can birth a new conversation. On the stages of black box theaters, to the impossible leaps of dancers, in a poet's calibration in quiet corners, we see this new kind of conversation. Bucknell can and needs to be at the forefront of such a journey. So the end of my talk is a new beginning. May some of you, students, come back in 30 years to give a talk of what you've learned. May that knowledge be generative. May that knowledge lead to love. And I actually hope to do that as well, 30 years from now. Bucknell offers a unique setting to provide a path towards such unusual generative intersections in ways that can be grounded in a place in Amish country called Lewisburg. I wrote about the Amish way of love in an essay in my first book. Let me end by reading this account with some recent modifications, reminding all of us that such a love, impossibility, and tragic beauty we can still come to know. This essay was written in my Ground Zero loft in New York City, 3 blocks from where the Twin Towers used to stand. Our Ground Zero journeys leave visible scars in culture. The battles about the imaginative territories of hope against fears, the sacrifice of love against a misplaced devotion, the anger of revenge against forgiveness. It is a battle that rages in the minds of youth as they negotiate the labyrinth of a techno-frenzied universe, sharing a communion of broken promises. When the manifestation of such collateral damage ambushes us, like in a pastoral Amish landscape, or in Littleton, Colorado in 1998, in a high school named after a delicate wildflower, or grade school in Newtown, or at the finish line of the Boston Marathon. We are astonished. John Hewitt, then the development director of the National Endowment for the Arts, who also happens to be an ordained minister, told me a poignant story. When evil struck the sleepy Amish community near Lancaster in 2006, when a gunman, milkman, systematically shot girls one by one, there was a hidden story in what he titled, "A Miracle Nobody Noticed." He wrote this, quote, "I am convinced most of us get through most days without thinking about God much. I was having one of those days a few weeks ago until I heard about Marion and Barbie Fisher, 2 of the 10 girls in West Nickel Mine Amish School. Marion, the oldest, was 13. Her sister Barbie, who survived, was 11. When it became obvious what was about to happen that ghastly morning, Marion turned to the killer and said, 'Shoot me and let the other ones loose. Shoot me and leave the other ones loose. Shoot me next,' Barbie said. 'Shoot me next.'" 2 children willing to lay down their lives for their friends. Wonder where they got an idea like that. That's another miracle nobody noticed, end quote. Perhaps, just perhaps, a new renaissance will be birthed out of the mouth of babes like these. Shoot me and leave the other ones loose. The girls did not complain, "This is unfair," or argue, "This is unjust." She just said, "Shoot me." Such fragile and heroic voices in the face of violence can easily be ignored or simply not audible with our doomed ears. It certainly did nothing to stop a milkman from unloading his anger by pulling the trigger. Perhaps such otherworldly gestures look as pathetic or beautiful as the string quartet that played on the Titanic as the ship sank. But I submit to you that here, in a miracle nobody noticed, is a bugle call also directed toward us artists. It begins in a belief that our lives are to be lived for others. Arts should let the other ones loose from the bondage to decay, apathy, and loss. To the extent that we are able to do that, to that degree, we will see a new language of expression that is not self-centered, but self-giving and generous. Yes, I believe that arts can and ought to exist apart from propaganda, from wars and violence, but in only place where this has been the case in the history of the world, in a place called Eden, where a poet named Adam dwelled, is today hidden inaccessibly beneath or above the rubble of Iraq. In Jesus' realism of saying these things must happen, he was also reminding us that our sacrifice either for justice or against injustice would not be the last word. Our efforts, however noble, will not end the root cause of injustice, our true ground zero conditions. But we are all given a call for self-sacrifice nevertheless. None are exempt, not even a pacifist 13-year-old secluded as far away from Iraq or Syria as humanly possible. And God knows firsthand what it means to die an unjust death without picking up a stone or a spear. But he still continues to breathe life into our funerary songs. So these girls knew love. Or maybe it should be said that love knew them. True knowledge is what we confess in facing the reality of death. So what is education? What does it mean to know love? How is our loves manifested in this place called Bucknell? Who dares to walk in the liminal path up the hill between life and death? And as you're leaving this place, you might want to look at the beautiful watercolor by Neil Anderson and ponder what it means for a dying leaf, autumn leaves, to generate such beauty and such life. Perhaps it is in that liminal journey that we can hear and recognize the invisible, ignored voices that are not audible with our doomed ears. These layers of thoughts and challenges I want to dedicate to the memory of my father, but also to the professors who had tremendous impact on me here on this campus, including Professor Michael Payne, Professor Jack Wheatcroft, who called me a true poet, Professor Carl Patton. The 3-hour rise of Bucknell have indeed grown generatively into the world as I continue to probe into the mystery of the art of education. Thank you very much.
Mako, thank you for moving us and inspiring us. It's very, very special. When we began to think about having art lectures, there were two ideas, and one was to shine a light on visual arts at Bucknell. And the other was to bring the brightest and best and most accomplished people who could elevate our understanding and thoughts about the visual arts. This is very special, and I am deeply appreciative. At the same time, I'm very proud to have you as one of our own. And I must say that last year I had the privilege of going to the Waterfall Gallery to get a whole gallery full of Mako's art. So if any of you happens to be in New York in the near future, I urge you to go by. It's a super experience. So with my thanks.
Thank you.
I'm very proud. And thank you.
Thank you. You know, we do have 10 minutes. Anybody have anything that I can address? Any thoughts, questions that I can? Yes.
Tell us when the commercial aspect of your art began.
Yes. So I was a national scholar student in Japan. I got married right after Bucknell to a girl I fell in love in this building, and we had our first child, Ty, that the unicorn story is about him. And so I had to think about the practical bottom line issues. But by then, I had learned that if you wanted to make a living as an artist, you really had to have an entrepreneurial plan for this. And I knew nothing about business. I knew nothing about entrepreneurial, how to start a business. So I had to learn. I began to pay attention to so many things that I never thought that I would need, but I wish I had taken management classes here. I wish, because that no matter what you are doing, whether you are an engineer or, a philosopher or artist, today, you have to reinvent yourself all the time. And you have to learn to make what you do, what you love, sustainable. And so I wrote Culture Care as a part of my way to communicate what I've learned over the years. There's a chapter in there called Business Care, which is the shortest chapter, but the one that I get most comments on, especially from business leaders. And many of the things that I talk about of finding an ecosystem or a triangle of capitals between creative capital and relational social capital and the bottom line material or the funding reality of your budget is what I had to learn. That in fact I had capital that can be leveraged, which is my creative capital. But that I needed to come alongside others or to invite others who had other capitals to realize this dream of making it as an artist. I could not do that on my own. I have to have people who will speak for me, a gallery hopefully, but it doesn't have to be a gallery, and people whose gifting is to manage the financial aspect of what I do. So I began to ask for those types of people to appear in my life, and they began to slowly but surely, all my 30 years of being able to make a living as an artist was because in some ways that was realized successfully. And wherever you are, whatever your stages are in life, even as a successful artist, you always have to make sure that it's creating an ecosystem that is balanced and that I always say, if you have two out of those three capitals, right? Material resources, relational capital, and creative capital. If you have 2 out of 3, you can make what you do sustainable. So, for instance, my second son, CJ, who was a Bucknellian, who does not have any money, but he has a lot of friends and great creative capital, he's going to do fine because he's going to sleep on people's couches and he's going to compose music and he's going to do fine. But you have to have 3 out of 3 to make it into a movement, making it into a generative practice that can affect and change and transform your communities. So I've been encouraging him to think this way, to think like an entrepreneur, investing in his gifts and his friends, that this can become a movement. And he's working on that. So thanks for the question.
Am I allowed a second question?
Sure.
I'm interested in how you met Martin Scorsese.
Yeah, so Saturday I'll talk more about that, but it was Mark Rogers who I met in Washington D.C. and Marty's here, in his team, wonderful team at Wedgwood, and Mark was a Senate liaison to Rick Santorum when I met him, but he had been thinking very intentionally about how cultural realities, politics is downstream from culture. So by the time the issue gets down to Washington, it's too late. It only becomes cultural war battles. So how do you rejuvenate the river, of culture? And so we began to talk about, Mark got involved in this production as a associate producer, and he introduced me to Martin Scorsese, but because he asked me to write a book about Shusaku Endo's novel, which came out in 1966, that Scorsese had for the last 28 years have journeyed with and wanted to make a film. Very difficult film to make. Doesn't make sense financially. This is really a case in which creative capital and social capital allowed for this production, and people who committed financial capital as well. But they knew that this may not be a blockbuster. It's not Star Wars, but they thought it was important, and so this came about because of persistence of Martin Scorsese. And so Mark asked me to write a book about silence, and I turned him down twice. And then he said, "Would you like to meet Marty and talk about this with him?" And I said, "Sure, I would love to meet with Marty and talk about my reluctance to write this novel." And that's how it happened. Thank you. Maybe one last question. Anybody? Yes? Yeah?
Your faith is very evident. Was your faith that strong when you were here at Bucknell?
No, although it depends on how you define that. I have come to believe that without faith, it is impossible to live. Faith of some kind. But you can't wake up in the morning and not have something to rely on. People, it's a contested word. It's I know that, but the clarity that I have been given came when I was a graduate student, around the time that I encountered Shusaku Endo and these objects of fumie, stepping blocks of 17th century. I'll talk more about that on Saturday, but I write about this in my book. And actually, I owe Professor Michael Payne, for entering into this thought that perhaps in literature, and especially in Western literature, in order to understand Milton and Blake and Shakespeare, I had to understand the Bible. And I took his class on reading the Bible and literature. And we read the Gospels, the Psalms with the King James version. And I remember writing several papers. Now, that was not my major, but that class on the Bible and William Blake probably reshaped my life, perhaps more than any other classes that I have taken. And so I'm grateful for him for introducing this thought. He wasn't trying to proselytize, he wasn't trying to do that, but nevertheless, I received something from him. And I was able to share that with him later in his career, and talked about Psalm 139 being one of the most important psalms for me and for him and for William Blake. So that was very special. So thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.